Good evening, and welcome to Discover Cal, the virtual lecture series that brings Berkeley to you. We hope tonight's program informs, enlightens, and inspires you. I'm Howard Huebner, Executive Director of Annual Programs at University Development and Alumni Relations here at UC Berkeley. This evening, we'll be talking about the economics of higher education. Before we begin the event this evening, we want to take a moment to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral unceded land of the Shoshone, Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold University of California, Berkeley more accountable for the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. We know that many of you are spread throughout the world on the land of other peoples and would like to take the time to acknowledge that ancestral history as well. I want to start off this evening by saying thank you. Thank you for your ongoing generous support of Cal. This includes the members of our Charter Hill Society and Benjamin Ide Wheeler Society members. The last 2 years have presented unique and complex challenges for all of us. And during this time, your support of Berkeley has been impactful, especially in raising funds for our students adversely affected by COVID-19 and supporting our testing and research efforts on campus. Before we dive into tonight's topics in our talks, I'd like to provide a brief campus update. It was a busy and hectic start to the semester. On January 31st, the campus returned to in-person as the default mode of instruction, and we haven't looked back. The campus is humming with the visible presence of students, faculty, and staff once again. We've begun to see COVID rates drop from the plateau of a few weeks ago. As of yesterday, March 7th, masks are no longer required for fully vaccinated individuals, but continue to be strongly recommended. With the return of students to campus, we see a great opportunity to rebuild a sense of community. I know this is an important point that Chancellor Crist has raised about the need for us to build a campus community that is better and stronger than it was before COVID turned our lives upside down. Addressing our campus housing needs is a crucial component of improving our campus community. To that end, earlier this semester, the university broke ground on a major development to provide housing for our transfer students. The Helen Diller Anchor House is a 772-bed apartment-style project that will be gifted to Berkeley upon its completion. Expected to open in time for the 2024-25 academic year, it's being designed, built, and funded by the Helen Diller Foundation. Rent for each housing issue will be below market rate, and the building require no public funds to construct or operate. Net income from the property will perpetually fund scholarships for low-income students at Berkeley. I want to share with you a major issue that has emerged in the last few weeks, which you've likely read about. It has enormous potential significance to our campus. Late last week, the California Supreme Court left intact a lower court order that will reduce and then freeze enrollment at 2020-2021 levels and prevent thousands of students who would have been offered in-person admission to UC Berkeley this fall from receiving that offer. This is devastating news for the thousands of students who have worked so hard for a seat in our fall 2022 class. Chancellor Crist and the campus resolved to fight on behalf of each of these students. The campus is engaging with state leaders to identify possible legislative solutions that could address significant impacts of the lower court's rulings on enrollment decisions at Berkeley and other UCC campuses. At the same time, the university is preparing to implement enrollment reduction in case there's no timely fix. These strategies will focus on mitigating the harm to prospective students, largely by increasing online enrollment and or asking new incoming students to delay enrollment until January 2023. We will also prioritize California residents for fall in-person undergraduate enrollment, as well as prioritize our commitment to transfer students. While the options are far from ideal, they are preferable to drastically reducing the number of offers of admission and denying so many students a Berkeley education. This strategy is designed so that the legislature provides relief very soon. We can pivot to making more in-person offers for the fall. I encourage you to find out more and stay up to date on the latest developments at news.berkeley.edu. As we consider what Berkeley means to the world, it helps to take into account the most recent rankings of universities. In this regard, Berkeley continues to be ranked among the top 4 global universities and the top public in the most recent US News Global Rankings. And a twist that surprised many, although hopefully not many here tonight. Forbes magazine this past fall named UC Berkeley the #1 university in the United States, outranking several private institutions you may have heard of. Forbes evaluated universities on broader standards of access and economic mobility, criteria which truly distinguish Berkeley in the landscape of higher education. This is a great segue to talk about our efforts to ensure that we maintain Berkeley's leadership position and address the pressing issues of our society. In the next 2 years, the campus is working to reach its goal of raising $6 billion for students, faculty, and research. Specifically, everything from scholarships and graduate fellowships to programs that expand access to a Berkeley education. Light the Way, the campaign for Berkeley, is now 90% of the way toward reaching its goal. As we approach the final leg of the campaign, the university is laser focused on 4 core priorities: capital projects, faculty positions, the undergraduate experience, and graduate fellowships. Among capital projects, one of our top fundraising priorities is the Gateway, which will be a game changer. Located on a key north entry point of campus, it will convene and connect faculty and students from our core disciplines of computing, data science, and statistics with others across campus. The work to be done at the Gateway will aim to solve society's most significant issues in health, climate change, and human welfare. You can learn more about these major priorities at light.berkeley.edu. On a more immediate front, and by immediate, tomorrow, we're excited to invite our entire Cal community to take part starting tomorrow night at 9 Pacific Standard Time in our 24-hour fundraising blitz known as Big Give. Through the day, Thursday, March 10th, we call on alumni, parents, students, faculty, staff, and friends, all of our community, all over the world to show support for our extraordinary university. Big Give is a wonderful opportunity to show support for your favorite school, college, or program on campus. There will also be many chances to multiply your impact during Big Give, thanks to matching gift opportunities from some of our most generous donors, and to take part in numerous contests to help support your favorite programs. Please bookmark biggive.berkeley.edu and come back tomorrow night to give, celebrate, and share with your Cal community and to check out our progress. With that, I'm excited to start tonight's topic. Our 3 speakers will discuss the economics of higher education, the issues we face at a macro level and locally here at Berkeley. Our first speaker is Jesse Rothstein. He's Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy and Economics with appointments in the Economics Department and the Goldman School of Public Policy. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the California Policy Lab. He previously served as the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor and a senior economist with the Council of Economic Advisors. His research examines education policy, tax and transfer policy, and the labor market. His recent work includes studies of teacher equality, school finance, intergenerational economic mobility, take-up of safety net benefits in the labor market during the Great Recession. Jesse, I'm super excited to learn more and to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. And your introduction is a reminder that I really need to update my photographs in some of the campus databases, but thanks a lot for having me. I'm going to try to share my slides and make sure everybody can see those. I hope those are there. I'm going to talk today. Great. I'm going to talk today about some research that I've done with some co-authors and also some work done by one of my former graduate students, Zach Bleemer, who got his PhD here and is now a postdoc at Harvard, about the college admissions process and thinking about what can we learn from past experience about who benefits most from going to an elite college and how we can use the admissions process to further our kind of state's goals. So let me start with the kind of broad question. There's always been a challenge in selective universities about who are the students who they should be trying to admit. If you can't take all of the students who want to come, should you be prioritizing the students who have the strongest academic credentials, who tend to be students who came from fairly advantaged backgrounds and had lots of support in building up those credentials? Or do you want to lean more towards students who may have somewhat weaker credentials, but have overcome more challenges to get there? You can tell either one of those, you could tell a story about how that's the right way of identifying students who can benefit most and who will be most successful in their lives. It's not clear that the students who come from the most advantaged backgrounds and therefore build up strong credentials, they may be in a position to contribute most to society and to benefit most from a selective college, but that ends up with a pretty inequitable admissions landscape. A more equitable approach gives students opportunities based on where they came from and may lead to finding students who are really have a lot of grit and a lot of potential to contribute once they're given the opportunity. They may benefit more or they may benefit less from selective colleges. This research, these 2 projects that I'm talking about, build off of experiments or policy changes that were implemented, one in Texas and one in California, the changed admissions to the flagship universities or to the most selected universities in each state. They're both known as percent plans. The first one was the Texas 10% plan. And then a few years later, California followed with something that it calls eligibility in the local context, which is a route to eligibility to the University of California. Both of them have a similar design in that they're trying to identify and admit students who have succeeded relative to their local contexts. So they de-emphasize test scores, they emphasize high school grades more, and in particular, they emphasize high school class rank. So students who may or may not come from an advantaged background, but who are in a high school and do better at that high school than the other students there. I'll talk a little bit more about how these two programs work. In Texas, the 10% plan, it implemented around the turn of the century, and it guaranteed that if you were in the top 10% of your high school class, you were guaranteed admission to any campus of the University of Texas. Not just the flagship at Austin, although that was the most important one, but also any of the other campuses. If you were in the top 10%, it didn't matter what your SAT scores were, you were guaranteed admitted into any campus that you wanted to go to. The one where that was most important was the University of Texas, Austin, where students who are in around the 10th percentile of their high school class probably wouldn't have been admitted otherwise, but it also had some impact at Texas A&M and some of the other state schools. What we found when we looked at this is we found that students who are above the 10th%, when that policy was implemented, you saw big increases in the share of students who went to the University of Texas at Austin, particularly from high schools that hadn't traditionally sent very many students to UT Austin. And those students, if you looked at those high schools before the program, what you could see is the students who got pulled into the University of Texas by this policy, most of them wouldn't have gone to college at all in the absence of the policy. Some would have gone to community colleges, but many of them just wouldn't have enrolled in college in the first place. So in contrast to what I think a lot of our intuition is, which is that the selective colleges are just competing with other selective colleges, we found that there were students who got into the University of Texas, Austin as a result of this, the flagship campus, who in the absence of that just wouldn't have gone to college after high school. California's eligibility in the local context was a bit different, but modeled on the Texas program. It was originally aimed at the top 4% of each high school class, and then later expanded to the top 9%. And the idea was that if you were in the top 4% of your high school class, you were automatically eligible to the University of California, even if otherwise your SAT score wouldn't have gotten you there. Now the top 4% is in California is actually not that high relative to the very selective admissions at Berkeley and UCLA. And so while some students around that threshold do get into Berkeley and UCLA, what Zach Bleemer found when he looked at this is the students who were right above the threshold didn't see increased chances of being admitted to Berkeley or UCLA as a result of this. They did see increased chances of being admitted to some of the other UC campuses, Davis, Irvine, Santa Barbara, and San Diego, which are all highly selective, but not quite as selective as Berkeley and UCLA. And what he found is that in the absence of the ELC rules, many of them, almost all of them would have gone to college, but they would have gone to less selective UCs or to California state universities or to community colleges. So it's a somewhat different program for the different states. But in each case, the students who were pulled into the more selective universities through this tended to come from relatively low income backgrounds compared to the average student who was enrolling at these universities. So these give you a good opportunity to understand what's the impact of being admitted to a highly selective university for a student who doesn't have the credentials to get in under the traditional rules, but has overcome challenges, has risen to the top of the pool that they were in high school. What happened? Again, you could imagine different stories. One possibility is that these are exactly the students who are going to take advantage of whatever opportunity they're given. And when you allow them into more selective universities, they'll take advantage of that. Another story you could imagine is these students are by some measures less qualified than the other students at these universities. And it may be that this is a overly competitive environment and that they struggle when they get into these universities. So you could have imagined either case. In fact, what we see in both of these studies is that the beneficiaries of these policies, the people who are admitted to these universities as a result of the percent plans, they're more likely to graduate than they would have been at their other universities. They're more likely to go to graduate school. They have higher earnings in their early careers, all of them than those same students would have had in the absence of this admissions guarantee. So it does look like pulling these students up into a more competitive pool benefited them. Another interesting thing that we could look at in Texas, but that was harder to look at in California, the Texas 10% plan was so big that it really swamped the University of Texas. Within a few years, 3/4 of the students who were admitted to the University of Texas were admitted under the percent plan, the 10% plan. And that meant that they had to tighten up the admissions on the other margins in order to make room for them. So there were a number of students who had high SAT scores from traditional feeder schools who got crowded out of the University of Texas as a result of this, or at least out of the University of Texas at Austin, the flagship campus. And we were able to track what happened to them as well. And what happened to them is that they tended to go to less selective universities. Instead of going to Austin, they went to the University of Texas at Dallas, say. But they were no less likely to graduate, and they didn't see any decline in their earnings as a result. So it looks like the non-traditional students who come from lower income, less advantaged backgrounds benefited from being given access to these universities. But the more traditional students who tended to have more family supports and more resources were able to be just as successful at less selective universities. And so on net, you increase the graduation rate, you increase the average earnings with this policy that expands equity in admissions. So I think a broad lesson from this work and from other work is that the admissions is not something where the answer is automatic. There's a policy choice that we make about who we decide to admit when we have a university that doesn't have the ability to admit all of the students who are qualified. Opening the doors to students who are traditionally kept out can yield big benefits for those students and for institutional equity without really imposing big costs on the students who are crowded out, who are likely to be successful even at other institutions. That implies that an exclusive focus on demonstrated academic excellence rather than on ability to overcome obstacles may not be either fair or efficient. And so to the extent that we have a limited number of seats to allocate, we do want to lean a little bit more towards equity, and I think we'll likely get better outcomes as a result of that. But I think there's a broader lesson to that kind of ties into some of the things that Howard talked about and we've been going through at Berkeley recently, which is that getting into a selective university can be very beneficial. And it's somewhat artificial that we limit the number of seats available. Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've greatly expanded the number of students who are going to college, but we haven't greatly expanded the number of seats at the most selective universities. And I think that there's a lot more room to try to expand that, both by expanding the existing campuses and by adding new campuses to make more seats available to students who are demonstrably qualified, but not qualified enough given how tight the admissions bar is at many of these universities. So I will stop there. Obviously, I sent my slides to Zach, and his first comment was, so obviously what we want to do is reduce the number of admissions at Berkeley in response to this. I think it's right that this is exactly not what we want to be doing right now and not what this research points to. But thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Jesse, thank you so much. It's super interesting, and like so many questions I have, but I think one of the questions in the chat is an interesting question about those who are the squeezed out population. While they didn't seem to be harmed, did they then relocate? Like, was there a proportion of them that would really relocate outside of California if they weren't able to get to their first choice schools, or were you able to track them in that kind of way?
So in the place where we were able to look at the crowded out students was more in Texas than it was in California.
Or in Texas.
Because okay. the California ELC just wasn't large enough to crowd out very many students.
Mm-hmm.
But in Texas, we were able to look at it. And one thing, so the data we were using didn't allow us to identify students who left Texas, but we had various proxies for that. Like, did we see them working in Texas later? We saw no reduction in the share who we saw working later in Texas. We saw no reduction in the share who we saw going to Texas universities. So while I'm sure there were students who left the state as a result, it didn't lead to a big exodus.
Okay. And then a follow-up question is, really around if in your research you have looked at, that definition, particularly those students that would have otherwise gotten in, right? And the social mobility created by higher education. Have you been able to look at that at all as far as kind of the outcome of this process or outcome of this research of just kind of thinking about, what is the impact for someone coming in from a lower socioeconomic status or may have had a little more grit to get through the process, and what does that kind of at the output of that, the end point of that, how does that impact their mobility?
Yeah, so I think there's this research and other lines of research in other places are all gradually tending to paint a picture that students who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds, who have some grit and have shown ability to succeed relative to their contexts, that they may benefit more from more selective universities than do students coming from more advantaged backgrounds. It seems like the students from more advantaged backgrounds have other resources they can draw on, and they don't necessarily need as much the resources of the selective university, but the students from more disadvantaged backgrounds benefit a lot, and they do see higher graduation rates, higher earnings if they're admitted to these universities.
And correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe this isn't part of the conversation, but it feels like both of these plans draw off of kind of the original master plan of higher education from California that was established in the 60s that we kind of, meandered around from. It does, I mean, there's some questions about the ongoing research about this, but is some of this informed by that history, or is it kind of trying to have this fresh look at it?
Yeah, I think the design of the eligibility in the local context program is very much driven by some of the history of the master plan, where we had what ends up being a pretty complicated process, where you're eligible for the UC system, but then you have to be admitted to individual campuses. It can be hard to make sense of, and that's. So the ELC, it sounds like it's a guarantee, but it's only a guarantee if you're into the system, not into individual campuses. There's actually another experiment I didn't talk about in Michigan, where students were identified in high school and told, you haven't applied to college yet, but we can tell based on your background that you're a fairly disadvantaged student and that you're very strong. And so we're guaranteeing you that if you apply to the University of Michigan, you're going to get in and you're going to get a 4-year scholarship. And that had huge effects on the number who went to college at all. And the ones who went were successful. So it greatly increased the share of those students who graduated from college. I think simplicity is another piece of this that we sometimes overlook, and I think it's going to come up in some of the financial aid discussions.
Right, like how do we administer it, right? Like that has to be, fantastic, super interesting, Jesse. Okay, I want to make sure I keep us on time. I could sit and ask you questions myself for quite a while, but I don't want to dominate that. So there are all kinds of questions in the chat and the Q&A that you have sparked, and so I hope that you'll take a few minutes and hop into those spaces and just share some more of your wisdom and experience on this topic. Just super fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.
There's a lot to keep up with, but I'll do my best. I look forward to more in the Q&A at the end.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it so much, Jesse. Thank you so much. Now, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker to build on this topic. Cruz Grimaldo is Assistant Vice Chancellor and Director of the Financial Aid and Scholarships Office here at Berkeley. Prior to serving in her current role, Cruz was Associate Director of Financial Aid and Scholarships, where she helped create the first Student Advisory Council in this very important area. She also supported the creation of the Fiat Lux Scholarship Program, uniting two needs-based programs to better serve our students. As a former first-generation college student at Berkeley who relied heavily on financial aid, her commitment to making our university affordable is driven by her own personal experience. Cruz, so excited to have you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Howard, and thank you, Jesse, for that really important kind of lead into my talk, which is really about what we're doing. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing here locally on the Berkeley campus to support students. So in addition to serving as the financial aid director for the campus. I'm the campus's 5th director of financial aid, and I'm still in touch with the former financial aid directors that are still alive. I also lead Cal Student Central, our one-stop shop for financial aid, billing and enrollment questions. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. You are each such a key part of the economics of higher education, and you should all be really proud of your investment. Okay, so I love Berkeley. It transformed my life, both as a student and as a staff member. And I love that my job is to support students with the resources they need to attend Berkeley. And we've been doing this a long time. We are the founding equity program on our campus. And many of the gifts that we award today were granted to us over a century ago and have been carefully stewarded to support students and are needed now more than ever. As we look at the current events in our world today, we need Berkeley students, creative, innovative, empathetic students to become leaders to help solve these really complex problems and create a brighter future. And you make that possible. Your generosity combined with the expertise on my team to deliver that support is what's making all of the difference. And our purpose is to support our students. In my role, I help keep the campus focused on our guiding mission of transforming lives through scholarship. We do that by ensuring that students have the resources to cover their food, rent, tuition, books, health insurance, and other personal expenses. And we help build a diverse community of scholars from a wide range of economic backgrounds. And we do that by offering the most generous financial aid packages that we can sustain. And that is our challenge. And that's what Berkeley is trying to do at scale. Our typical incoming class, which we know is in debate at the moment, is 9,500 students. And that's much larger than Stanford's entire undergraduate enrollment of 6,400 students. As Director of Financial Aid and Scholarships, I want students to know that a Berkeley education is attainable, invaluable, and infinitely bountiful. And I think our outcomes are a testament to that. Most of our students receive some form of financial aid. 65% of our students graduate with no debt. And the 35% of students that do borrow much less than the national average of around $30,000. We hover around 18 or 19,000, which is much lower than the price of a new car. And a Berkeley education will only appreciate in value. About 40% of our students pay nothing out of pocket for tuition, and over a quarter of our students are eligible for the federal Pell Grant, which is just a marker of the students with the most financial need. And thanks to you, our Berkeley students receive about $47 million in donor-funded support. But financial aid includes this includes all sources of funding that students may use to pay for their educational expenses. So it includes grants, scholarships, loans, and also the work-study program. And I'd like to highlight that we have the strongest work-study program in the UC system, and our students are earning $10 million annually towards the cost of their education. And that's really helping to keep their borrowing as low as possible. So the big question is, what does it cost to attend Berkeley? And as you can see, for Californians, it's hovering around $40,000 and around $70,000 for our non-California students. But you'll also see that tuition is less than half of that total expense at $14,226. So it's really all of the other costs, the costs of living, that are contributing to the total cost of attendance. And this is an example of one of our lowest income students. These examples all represent schools in the Bay Area, but there's a few things to note here. The overall cost change based on the type of school, which is to be expected. And you can see the amount of total grant and scholarship support also varies across campus. And that leads to a calculation of what's called the net cost. And that's what students and their families will actually need to pay out of pocket or by borrowing or through a work study program or student employment. And you'll see that that students who opt into the UC system have the lowest net cost because of the additional resources that the UC system can bring to bear to students. And so, you know, I think as students are negotiating and making choices about where to attend college, it's really important that they look at the net cost and not just the overall cost of attendance in making those choices. You know, especially with what we know the outcomes can be for students who do select, who do opt into the more selective schools. And scholarships are our most important levers because many of the awards that we help steward for students are tied to the student. And so scholarships are the one resource that we can really manage locally and direct specifically to specific students to meet specific enrollment goals and or emerging needs. And they can make all of the difference. And so I wanted to highlight just some, a dashboard that we have made available for you to take a look at some of our financial aid data and outcomes. There is a tab for financial aid, and we have some helpful information about our Pell Grant recipients, our overall loan debt compared to other UCs, and just the review of how costs have changed over time. And finally, I just want you all to know that we care very deeply about our students, our faculty, and our communities, and we're here to support them every step of the way. And it's you know, critical to us that we help students be successful. So happy to take any questions.
Cruz, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Before we jump into your the questions for you, I'm going to ask all of our participants who are attending today to please use the Q&A to organize your questions. As you can tell from the chat now, there's just so many questions piling in that it's a little hard to keep them organized to have folks actually be able to answer them. So if you could move your questions to the Q&A, it'll allow our speakers a better chance to make sure that your question's answered. Because right now there's a lot of questions popping up, but in the chat, but unfortunately they're getting buried. So it'd be better to put them in the Q&A because we can manage them better from there. So I hope that you all will help out with that and make that happen. So, okay, Cruz, back to you. Thank you so much for your chat. I mean, what important work that you all are doing. I'm speaking of which, I'm trying to find some of the questions right now. You know, I think one of the questions I know I have for you as I'm looking through what else we have to talk about is, you know, I know that the pandemic caused a significant crisis in kind of the student aid world. And can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you did, that your office had to do, or how you all managed that crisis from the student perspective?
Yes, you know, and during the time of COVID, we did suffer some enrollment losses, but those, you know, the students that we found didn't attend weren't our lowest income students, and they weren't necessarily our California students. And so we're happy that we were able to provide support to keep our lowest income students in attending school. So we did a lot of things over the last 2 years. We created, you know, we helped build up funding into the Student Emergency Fund so that we could help students with relocation expenses when they had to move out of the dorms in a short amount of time. We helped them with technology needs. Many students needed laptops and hotspots, and we helped students with all of those expenses. We also distributed millions of dollars of COVID relief funding that were granted to us from the federal government. And so we very quickly distributed, I think at last count was over $50 million to both our undergraduate and graduate students in a very, you know, proactive way without them needing to make an application, so that they would have the resources that they needed. We also reevaluated hundreds and hundreds of students, as their family's financial strength changed during the pandemic. And we're really thankful to receive some very generous gifts to target the changing financial strength in these families specifically. So it's been, a bit of a whirlwind, and there's still a lot, we're still not, over the pandemic. There's still emerging needs for our students. But I think that as an institution, I'm feeling really proud of the way that we have worked really hard to take as good care of our students as we can.
As a peer, and I just want to just thank you and your team, because we know that work was intense for so many of you. One of the questions that came up in the chat, and I think it might be, I'm not sure if this is exactly in your space or not, but it might be to see what you have a thought, is really talking about the value. It's kind of the return on investment in education, like the value in education, right? And we look at different majors and the career opportunities that follow those majors. Does it pencil out? You know what I'm saying? Like, does it actually, like, does it follow that the current set of majors and opportunities we have actually align with the cost? Like, are they able to kind of have a career post-graduation that matches up with the current society? The question kind of goes into really some thoughts about are our majors and our degrees aligning with what's happening in society in general, and kind of that return on investment. I don't know if from your office you're looking at that analysis, or if you have thoughts on that, but I thought I'd put it out there for you.
Yeah, and I do know that this is a topic that has been studied in terms of what outcomes are of our graduate students. But what I know about the Berkeley education is that it is transformative, and if as our graduating seniors, if they're if the 35% that do borrow, if their total loan indebtedness is $18,000, those are very while no debt is ideal, the loan repayment on that amount of debt is very reasonable, and our students do well with employment opportunities after graduation. And so I know that our some metrics that support that are our loan default rate. We have a very low loan default rate, ranges between 1% and 2%. Our students are paying back their loans, and so that's one metric that speaks to the fact that our students are after post-graduation have many opportunities.
Cruz, I want to make sure, I mean, there's a lot of questions. So I hope that you could take a few minutes and go through and help us answer some questions in the Q&A. I want to make sure we get to our final speaker and keep us all on time. So if you could pop in the Q&A, there's some really specific questions in there for you that probably be better for you to give one-off answers. And I know Jesse's in there. I could see him in there working hard to try to answer some of the questions from his talk as well. We're grateful for both of our previous panelists working to help kind of, what a great topic that we have this much engagement and excitement about. So glad to have it. Our final speaker this evening is Christopher Edley, Jr. He's Interim Dean of the Graduate School of Education and the Honorable William H. Orrick, Jr. Distinguished Professor at Berkeley Law. Chris was Dean of Berkeley Law from 2004 to 2013, after 23 years as a Harvard Law professor. His academic work is in administrative law, civil rights, education policy, and domestic public policy generally. Professor Edley has moved between academia and public service, each enriching the other and together giving him broad familiarity with many areas of public policy. He served in the administrations of Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, and held senior positions in 5 presidential campaigns, including senior policy advisor for Barack Obama. From 2011 to 2013, he co-chaired the National Commission on Educational Equity and Excellence and co-chairs the Follow-On Effort for Each and Every Child. Dean Edley, what an honor. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to hearing all about what you have to say.
I have 2 very difficult acts to follow, so I won't feel badly if people tune out right now. Here's what I'm trying to do. Back in the 1980s, when I first got seriously interested in the post-secondary finance problem, I felt like it was too difficult to learn. So I turned my attention to national security issues as it happened. But I never forgot about it. I've made some recommendations during the '88 campaign when I was the issues director for candidate Michael Dukakis, who I hasten to add was not really a loser. I think of him as the silver medal candidate. Here's what I think we should try to do. It is complex. It's complex for students, families, policymakers, the public. It's a complicated issue in political campaigns. And it's so important to our society that its very impenetrability is a challenge to us, because there should be it should be a part of our national discourse. What's the best way to provide opportunity for the next generation? The second thing that's wrong right now is that it creates so much anxiety for students and for their families. There's the financial anxiety related to debt, related to whether or not they can even afford to go to college. And remember, it's not a calculation about whether college is affordable. It's more than that. It's also whether subjectively the family and the student look at the system and feel as though college is a serious possibility for them. I think a third problem here is that you can't be sure about your future income. So the idea of taking on debt when you are so uncertain about how your career will unfold, that also produces anxiety. Another thing is that the prospect of debt is a burden on what students decide to major in. They may decide that they have to major in engineering when what they really want to study is Celtic poetry. And afterwards, can they pay back their undergraduate debt if they become a teacher or an artist? Or do they instead have their career choices limited by the burden of debt repayment? And finally, there are these perpetual legislative budget battles on an annual basis. How much federal money, how much state money to put into the variety of financial aid and loan programs that are out there. And in response to this, what we've heard from many politicians on the left and on the right are some politically implausible reform proposals. And as much as, for example, as much as we may want college to be free, or even community college to be free, in the state of national politics now, it simply doesn't seem like a plausible political calculation. So what kind of revolution am I after? If I can get my screen to move. Okay, here's the basic design. I have proposed what I'm calling a national college security bank. And here's how it would work. States would opt in to this system if they like it. So it's not something that is required of every state. It is something that states could choose to opt into. But once a state has opted into it, there's no possibility for individual students or individual schools to opt out. everybody would be covered. Second point is that students who attend a participating institution would pay no tuition, zero tuition. But the institution would announce what I'm terming a shadow tuition. In other words, if they were going to charge the students with tuition, here's how much it would be. Third, the bank would then make payments to colleges in lieu of tuition. So those participating colleges, they won't get the tuition revenue. Instead, they'll get a check from the NCS bank. The fourth point is that graduates, after people leave the institution, graduates would pay a % of their adjusted gross income for 20 years. My rough calculation is that that rate would vary from 0.5% to probably 2.5%, maybe 3% for 4 years at the most expensive public institutions. But let me highlight that the modeling that needs to be done is very complex. And I'm working with the US Department of Education to get some additional modeling done so that we can pin down what that tax rate would have to be. But the idea is that the tax rate will vary depending upon the shadow tuition of the institution. If someone goes to a community college to get a certificate in automotive engineering, the shadow price would be low, and the tax rate that they would pay after finishing the program would also be very low. If instead they go to an expensive institution, get a BA, the shadow price would be higher, and the percentage of adjusted gross income that they would pay would be higher. The modeling, again, is what we need to figure out precisely how. Those are the key features of it. And note the idea here. No tuition when you attend, but you pay into the bank after you're finished. There's no opt-out for individual students because we don't want the students who are headed towards business or investment banking to opt out of this system, so that the only people who are in it are people who will have lower incomes, expect to have lower incomes. And we don't want particular institutions to opt out either because of the same kind of adverse selection problem. What we want is as many people and institutions within a state as possible to participate, so that in the aggregate, the tax rate, the opportunity tax that graduates pay will be as low as possible for everyone. Two other little items here. One is that there's always this question of where will the NCS Bank get the startup capital that it will need to give payments in lieu of tuition to the colleges before enough years have gone by that the tax paid by the graduate balances out the payments in lieu of tuition that the bank will have to make. The way to think about this is that free tuition now, but then through your taxes, you benefited from free tuition, and now you're going to pay so that the following generation has the same opportunity that you did. And the last key point I want to make is that it would not require an annual appropriation by Congress. And here's why. I think this is a very little understood fact. Since legislation in 1990 signed by President G.W. George Herbert, G.H. Bush, the way the federal government budgets for loan and insurance programs is not by appropriating the full amount of the money that will be lent, whether it's a loan to some country to buy F-16 fighter jets, a loan to an entrepreneur who's starting a small business, whatever the kind of loan or whatever the kind of insurance, all that has to be appropriated is an amount that pays for any interest rate subsidy in the program, that covers the risk of default from the borrower, and that covers the administrative costs of running the program. So, for example, the SBA can make $1 billion in loans based on only $16 million in appropriation. So let's look at our program, the NCS Bank. First of all, no interest rate subsidy involved. Secondly, the risk of default is as close to zero as one could imagine because the tax is collected by the IRS. Third, the cost of administration can simply be folded into the tax rate that is assigned across the participating institutions. So in principle, it's possible to run this program without an annual appropriation, unlike the politically implausible proposals that require multi-billion-dollar appropriations for years into the future. So let me say a little bit about, do I have like 2 more minutes?
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay. So think about it this way. This program uses a different conception of fairness. Right now, we think about financial aid in an ex-ante way. We think about financial aid before the student shows up on campus. This would shift the fairness calculation to what happens to the graduate, to the ability to pay, the income of the graduates, kind of roughly related to the benefit they received by paying zero for their college education. So a different kind of fairness, ex post rather than ex ante. A second thing is think about the tens of millions of families and prospective students who today are asking themselves, how will I pay for the cost of college? If this were adopted, all of those anxieties, all of those concerns would disappear overnight. Third, making the percentage a flat tax, so let's say it's 2% of adjusted gross income if you go to Berkeley. It doesn't matter whether you leave Berkeley and become a teacher or an investment banker. It'll be 2% of what you earn. So if you want to study Celtic poetry, graduate and write some, 2% of whatever you can earn writing Celtic poetry. I think this is a prescription for freedom, for opportunity, for increased equity. States and institutions are free to set their shadow tuition, and indeed they're free to stick with the system we have now. All the money that states, the federal government are currently putting into financial aid has to stay in the system, in part for the states that don't opt in, but also because even for the states that opt in, as we've heard from Cruz, there are costs of attendance beyond tuition, and a financial aid system of some sort is needed to help with those. Why don't I subside now and see if we have any time for questions? Thanks, Howard.
Of course, super interesting. I'm actually trying to take a minute to kind of comprehend the model and consider it. And so, one of the questions, we have two questions for you. I think one question really being, how do you even begin to pilot, or what's the pragmatic approach to actually being able to address a model like this in our current state of affairs? I mean, is it finding a single state, is it being a jurisdiction, et cetera, and piloting it? Like, what does that look like?
No, I don't think so. I think the way to do it, just to be concrete, is my hope is over the next 4 to 6 months, the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Treasury Department will do enough modeling so that we would know what kind of tax rate would be needed across the range of shadow tuitions in order to make the system balance out. Once we have those parameters, if the maximum tax rate is 3% on the most expensive public university, I believe it would be politically feasible even in this Congress. If the modeling shows that it's 5%, I think that's too expensive, and the proposal would have to be narrowed to maybe just cover community colleges and public vocational education. But if that modeling is done, and given the fact that states can opt in, this will appeal, I believe, to both red states and blue states. Not all of them, but enough of them to get it off the ground.
Yeah.
And the time when it would happen would be summer of 23 or 24.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that summer. And then just one other question that came up from the audience, I want to feed it back through, and it's really about the affordability of college, and about how. So I'll really just read the question for you. I won't paraphrase. This person's belief is that ideally, people who want to go to college should be able to go to college, but also believe that when grants are offered by the government that make college "quote unquote" affordable, many more people, colleges increase their prices dramatically because demand went so far up. I don't know if that's factually accurate, and I'm hoping you can help correct that. And does this idea help keep tuition and expenses in check from your perspective, as far as that kind of seesaw market share kind of concept that they're proposing?
Okay, well, I've given you the basic design. One way to address cost creep at colleges is to move beyond the basic design and put in some constraints on the pace of increase in college costs. That could be done at the federal level. But I think a different answer is to say the inflation of college costs is really a matter for the states to worry about in relation to the burdens that their students are going to face when they graduate. In other words, a state has to know that if it lets the costs of its public institutions escalate, then its students, its citizens, are going to end up paying more in taxes. So that's a policy tension that could be worked out at the state level, and they can decide, do they want more laboratory space, or do they want to keep the tuition, the shadow tuition, as low as possible? It's not necessary in this legislation that we have federal cost controls. Nobody's been able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, just as far as this question in particular, it's this assumption that the market cost of college is actually not tied to the divestment from states into the college system, into the higher education system in some ways. And so what it's interesting about your proposal is that kind of that tax-based shift almost, right? Like just it's a little tied a little bit more to the direct income. And so it's a pretty fascinating concept.
That's right. If states opt in, part of the deal is if you're going to opt in, then you have to make a commitment to what's called maintenance of effort. The money you're putting into higher education right now, Montana, has to stay in higher education. You can't pull it back because because the national bank is making payments in lieu of tuition.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dean Edley. It's such a super interesting concept and so grateful for you to share it with us this evening. We are right at time, and so I want to thank all of my speakers. It's okay. No, it's great. It's been a great conversation just all the way through the evening, and there's so much interest in the chat and the Q&A. And I know that Jesse and Cruz have been working through there, and Dean Edley, if you have a few minutes to look at some of those questions in the Q&A as well. We are just incredibly grateful to our speakers, and I want to thank all of you for being part of this really important conversation. Again, obviously, from all the questions in the chat and the Q&A, it's clearly we hit a topic that has a lot of interest, and I'm grateful for that level of investment and enthusiasm about higher education. I look forward to your continued engagement and support as we as an institution work to address the issues of finance and higher education. The campus is, as always, grateful for your time, your support, your energies. And again, in recognition of the time, I know there's some questions we didn't get to, but we're just so grateful for all of your enthusiasm, and thank you so much. And I hope you all have a good evening, and go Bears. Thank you.